All right. If you have your Bibles, I know it's weird. We're going to be in the Bible just for a second, and then we're going to go back to not reading the Bible because we're at church. Psalm chapter 90. Psalmist toward the middle of your Bible. Psalm chapter 90, verse 2. Last week we presented kind of the state of affairs by which we find faith in science today. Okay, and we said there's this false dichotomy that says that Christians are kind of these mindless, brainless sheep that follow faith, and they just drink the Kool-Aid, and regardless of reason or science or evidence or anything else like that, they just follow whatever they want to follow. And yet, on the other side, you've got the scientific community who is based in fact and evidence and the scientific method, and these are these two, this is a dichotomous relationship between the two of them. So if you believe in datum and you believe in proof, you be scientific. And if you want to believe that there's something after death rather than garbage and darkness, then you are a Christian so that you can just have some hope for your soul, even though, empirically speaking, we all know that's got to be completely false. So last week we talked about that each of those actually are full of faith statements, and that this dichotomy we've made between faith and science is empirically invalid. It's flawed for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that to believe in science at its core is to say that every gap in what we know to be true is an inference that you're making. So science is full of faith statements, faith-based statements, okay? A faith-based statement is when you've made a jump in logic between what we can know and then what we infer, okay? So almost every part of science, which can only deal with that which is observable, measurable, and repeatable, when it comes to the big questions of this world, the starry host above and the law that exists within, from love to the way that we interact with one another, science doesn't really have anything to say about it, okay? But we get caught saying phrases like, well, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. Science literally means the pursuit of knowledge. And the problem with saying, I don't believe in God, I believe in science, is if you don't believe in God, that's not a scientific fact. You haven't used the scientific method in order to disprove God, so you actually can't put those two things as being incongruent with one another. They're not mutually exclusive. Someone who believes in science, which means the method by which we are able to understand through observation and testing things that are true, you don't categorically say, therefore, God can't exist, so it's either one or the other. So this series is looking at basically my faith journey from atheism to not just theism, but Christianity. And today, after last week saying there's not really a differentiation between fact-based things and Christianity. In fact, those are what we call NOMA principles, non-overlapping magisterium authorities, saying that anyone who says science can disprove God is actually completely misunderstood in what those two things are able and capable of doing. Okay? So after we said that, today we're going to look at what does the God hypothesis look like. So if the next step in the scientific method is after we've kind of made observations, we made some observations last week. So here's some observations about the universe. The universe is made with complexity. Okay, there's great intricacy involved in the universe. All right, and like we said last week, if something has even the most basic complexity, we would say that there was intelligence that came along with it. Okay, I use the example of the pool table. If you walk up to a pool table and there are 15 balls that are just arranged in a triangle, you would assume someone was there and racked those. Okay? Now, conversely, if you look at all of the universe, of which there is an infinite number of complexities inside of it, this is our state of observation of the universe. These are just things that we can say, and there's not really a good argument against them. Like, does anyone want to say that there's not complexity in the universe? We have to define what complexity is, and I think it's the opposite of simplicity. Okay? Simplicity has a very simple observational explanation, whereas complexity does not. Okay, whenever the more vessels that go into something being able to have to be there in order to be true or having to be working, we would say they're complex. Okay, so that my iPhone works and that this capo fits on your guitar, this is a simple, you got this push against this, there's a wedge, there's a lever that goes along with it. Now, this is still really neat, right? We've got rubber on this so it holds on the guitar, but I could come up with one of these if you gave me enough time. There is not a chance in God's blue universe that I would get anywhere near making an iPhone, right? Like I just don't understand. It's complex. Our universe is complex, okay? Scientists right now, even atheists, would say that the number of anthropic coincidences, anthropic principles that need to exist for there to be life anywhere in our universe, the odds of it happening out of random chance are 1 in 10 to the 138th power. Now, if you're not really big on exponents and understanding what that means, let me give you a little bit of framework for that, okay? An atom is basically the most basic building block of life. Now we know there's subatomic particles, that whole jazz. But an atom is to an orange what an orange is to planet Earth. Okay, so that's how small an atom is. So that proportionally speaking, an atom is to an orange what an orange is to the whole freaking world. Okay, so on your hand, there's hundreds of billions of trillions of atoms right there. Okay, now there's 1 in 10 to the 70th atoms in our universe, not in our solar system. In our universe, there's 1 in 10 to the 70th. That means volumetrically, every star, every planet, every asteroid, every bit of space dust, even a bit of space dust will have hundreds of millions of atoms on that. There's only 1 in 10 to the 70th atoms in our universe. And the odds, that means if you had every atom in the universe lined up, and it's just astronomical. And I let you transcend all the different galaxies, and you go past the Horsehead Nebula and everywhere out, and then you finally arrived at a planet, and you go, I think it's on this planet. And then the planet is the size of Jupiter, but it's not gaseous, it's formative, and you have to, it's dense, so you had to dig, and you went, I'm going to dig down 15 miles to the core of this planet, and then I'm going to pick up this bit of dirt, and on that bit of dirt is 100 million atoms, and I'm going to choose that single atom. The odds of that being the one that was chosen is the same odds that our universe came out of basic chance. A lot of mathematicians would say about 1 in 10 to the 20th to 1 in 10 to the 25th power, a mathematician would consider like astronomically improbable, like saying it's basically impossible for it to happen. Now you're talking about 1 in 10 to the 138th power of complexity arriving out of random chance. Now, even when we say complexity arrives out of random chance, we're actually already giving an atheist the ability to borrow things that didn't exist in the first place. So we're saying, okay, well, what if we gave you all these things? What are the odds that life came out of it? Now, what are the odds out of nothing that everything appeared? 0, okay? So the odds of random chance occurring in our universe is still arguing that you're able to have basic matter and basic principles and all those coming from those simple things. But I've already given you those things. Now, if I don't give those to you, try to make complexity out of nothingness. That is categorically impossible. So we see complexity in the world. Love, there's something weird about human beings and our want to be wanted and our want to be loved. And it goes even beyond our need to keep the human race going, because the human race is not the same thing as keeping my race going or my people group or my family even going. I give money to Hurricane Harvey victims so that they can stay alive, which goes against everything we know to be true about Darwinian evolution. I should want them to die because they could infiltrate and affect my ability to procreate, reproduce, and not die because they could possibly eat me in Darwinian evolution. Now, I understand that we don't eat people all the time, just on the weekends, but that's neither here nor there. But there seems to be this love aspect of things. Objective moral values, that no matter what society you kind of go to in the world, there's these basic principles that guide them unless there is a man or a dictator figure that says this is how it is, and for a time it shifts. But as soon as they go back to default society, there still seems to be this idea of what you did was wrong, right? Objective moral value, we're different than animals, the physical world exists. These are just our simple observations about the universe. Now, you can make a lot more observations, but these are kind of, to begin the hypothesis, to begin your scientific method, we just got to look and go, here's what we see to be true, okay? So, the next slide says this. Identifying variables. Here's our next step. We are going to present the God hypothesis today, and then we're going to check it in the scientific method. Here's the God hypothesis. Here's my hypothesis that I'm going to make. Okay, this is how you do all science. Make a hypothesis. Here's my hypothesis. An intelligent designer made the universe with purpose, on purpose, for a purpose. An intelligent designer made the universe, everything that we know to be true, what is material and immaterial, made everything on purpose, by purpose, for. That's my hypothesis that we're going to test today. Okay? The cosmological argument for the existence of God goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Eternal things don't need causes. Eternal things can always be. But everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe, the second part of it is that the universe began to exist. So this is called modus ponens. It's the most basic line of argumentation. If P, then Q. We see that P is true, therefore we can conclude that Q is true. So if everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the second part of it, Q, is the universe began to exist, then it follows logically what? That the universe has a cause. If everything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Cause always flows from intelligence and design, okay? Inanimate things don't cause things. They're not causal. Now, if you go, well, what about a machine that makes an iPad? There's still intelligence behind it. So you're just arguing an infinite regression that eventually leads to an intellect, okay? I'm not saying it's the God of the Bible. I'm not saying you need to believe that Jesus came back from the dead. My hypothesis today is simply this. A super intellect, an eternal super intellect made everything. That's my argument. So we got to identify variables. Well, what are the other theories? What are other things we can come up with? That's what a Christian might say, or that's what a theist might say, or an intelligent design arguer might say. What about the other thoughts? Okay, so I put on the board the 5 other most pervading, the most popular thoughts in all of atheism about how the universe began to exist. The first one is called the static state universe. Okay, that makes sense. That you don't need a beginning because the universe has always been here. It doesn't move, it doesn't shape, it doesn't twist. Everything just is suspended in time, and it's just there. Okay, that's a hypothesis. The eternal pastime argument, very similar to the static state universe, but eternal pastime says it doesn't have to be static, it doesn't have to be not moving. Maybe it's just constantly warping and changing and moving, but it's always been that way. Okay. The third is called the nothing hypothesis. The nothing hypothesis is the easiest one to explain. It's not complicated, okay? What do we perceive in the material universe? Everything, space, time, dark energy, dark matter, mass, neutrinos, subatomic particles, everything that we know to exist. Where did all that come from? Nothing. So nothing made everything. You can explain it, my son can explain this to you, okay? This is the argument from nothing. The nothing hypothesis is, well, we know what nothing can do. Now, when I say nothing, don't think of a space, don't think of vacuum, don't think, like, what's in my hand right now? Yeah, a lot of things. Probably some of your dead skin cells are between my hands right now, okay? There's microparticles, there's air, there's oxygen, there's carbon dioxide, there's all these chemicals, there's helium, there's everything that makes up our atmosphere from nitrogen, there's carbon. This is what's inside of my hand. There's not nothing in my hands. There's space in my hands. Picture nothing. You can't even picture nothing because all you're going to picture is darkness. And darkness isn't nothing. Okay? Darkness still exists in space and time. Nothing is nothing. Okay? So the nothing hypothesis says, what do we know about nothing? Will, what do we know about nothing? What can it do?
Nothing.
What can it create?
Nothing.
What is it capable of knowing? Okay, it's a philosophical argument. It's simple. If there's nothing there, nothing keeps being nothing and doesn't change. As astrophysicists would say, out of nothing, nothing comes. Okay? But the hypothesis is, what if everything we know about nothing and have proven about nothing is actually the opposite and everything came from nothing? Huh? Number 4, the multiverse. The multiverse says, okay, when you look at these odds, as Richard Dawkins would say, his hypothesis is called the lucky S hypothesis. In other words, yeah, it's 1 in 10 to the 138th power, but lucky S. And you go, wait, did you really just say that? Like 1 in 10 to the 138th power. And you say, lucky S. How? And you go, well, if you have an infinite number of tries, well, you don't have an infinite number of tries. The universe expanded one time. So in one moment, in one blast of energy and light, everything was set so perfectly that 1 in 10 to the 138th power chance of it happening an accident. So this is where some people get confused. They go, well, we've had an eternity to evolve. Well, the universe expanded in 1 billionth of a second. And it didn't get a lot of chances to do that. So don't use this whole, well, monkeys in a room typing to infinity eventually will produce a coherent work of Shakespeare. Like they'll produce the complete works of William Shakespeare. Okay? Well, first of all, that's a garbage theory. B, it's got no data that represents it. C, that never actually has to happen. D, you have to remember that you don't have monkeys in a room to start out with. You have nothing. So that's like if I said, okay, I'm going to give you space, and I'm going to say, in this room is just an empty room. What odds do you want to put on it that if I gave you an eternity, that eventually you would walk in here and there'd be a complete set of Encyclopedia Britannicas perfectly laid out in English with factual data, historically accurate? Would that ever happen? Ever? What if I gave you an infinite number of years? Would it eventually happen? No. Why? Because a single sentence denotes intelligence, okay? So as soon as that happened, right? So the multiverse theory, all that really says is, well, since our world is so complex, there's no way it came out of chance. But what if there's a multiverse generator that spits out universes, and one of them that it spit out was just ours, which is really, really complex. But there's another universe out there that's really, really simple. And their physics, like, if you want to make life there, you just go, and life just appears. And then in that other universe, through the work of panspermia, which is aliens from that universe, jumped space-time continuums, came into our universe, and seeded intelligence in our universe. And that's why we're here. That's literally one of the theories of why there's life on planet Earth. It's called panspermia. When you look at that stuff, you just go like, what are you talking about? Okay? But multiverse theory says, well, what if there's just a whole bunch of universes? Okay? The big crunch theory is also called the oscillating theory or the accordion universe, where we go, well, the universe is eternal and it just keeps expanding and contracting. About every 20 billion years, the universe expands and then it contracts over and over again. It's always been doing this, okay? And then the last one is intelligent design, okay? That a super intellect, transcendent of space and time, made everything. Okay? We call this the God hypothesis. The hypothesis is this: a super intellect, transcendent of space and time, created everything on purpose, by purpose, for a purpose. Okay? So we're going to test these. Next thing we have to do is we gather information, we test variables. Okay? If these are the most coherent ones, does anyone have another way that they believe the universe existed outside of these? You go, well, I heard, you're like, well, on the back of a turtle, right? You guys heard that whole thing? Anyone else have one that you go, this is one that I think is really rational? And you're going to have a hard time because in reading the God delusion, in reading all of A Brief History of Time, these are the most coherent theories from every atheist on the planet. Okay, and there's not really another one outside of it. The only other one is the I don't know hypothesis, which is a non-answer. That's not actually a solution to anything. Okay, so let's gather information. Next slide. Here's the information we gather. In 1850, we discovered something called entropy. Okay, what entropy means is that energies inside of a system, they move from order to chaos and they break down over time. Okay, so any matter of energies inside of a system breaks down over time. That's what entropy is. Okay, so in other words, have any of you guys ever poured a cup of coffee and you're in a regular room temperature and you came back 3 hours later and the coffee was hotter than when you left, than when you first had it? No. In fact, I worked at Olive Garden, and if you left someone's fettuccine alfredo sitting for 90 seconds, they called it dead food, and they made a new batch of it. Because in 90 seconds, that fettuccine alfredo can go from like 120 degrees to like 88 degrees, that quick. Why? Because all that energy is in heat is you stir up these you make all this energy, and the heat, the friction of them moving around so quickly in a microwave, shooting these little microwaves all over that thing, heats up your food. Well, the inertia of our universe says eventually they want to slow down. They're not going to keep going, let's go faster and faster. If you're not promoting that, they're going to slow down. And your food's going to get colder and colder and colder. Okay? So, entropy. All energies in a system break down over time. In the year 1915, a brilliant man by the name of Albert Einstein came up with the theory of relativity. This gave us the first time in history that we were able to talk congruently and coherently about past time. Thank you, Albert Einstein. We needed that. One of the problems with Albert Einstein's theory is he didn't attribute that time was a part of physics. He didn't believe that time was part of the physical world. He thought that time was simply a placeholder for understanding the passing of a chronological sequence. So he didn't include time into his theory of relativity. Until Hubble, who built a real big telescope, looked out in the universe and discovered something called the red light shift. So he stared out at all of what we can see, and he realized that that light in the universe was shifting. When he realized the shift of the universe, he came up with a theory called expansionism. Okay? And now it's been proven to be true. The universe is actually expanding. That we are hurtling away from other things because space is growing in and of itself. Well, this changed Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. In fact, Albert Einstein called it the biggest blunder of his life, not to realize that time was a part of physics. Well, Hubble corrected that. Now we know the universe is expanding. Okay? Not only that, but in 1978, there's cosmic microwave background radiation. So this guy named Penzias was listening to the universe, seeing if he could come up with a whole bunch of different stuff to support one of his theories, including intelligent life. And so he starts listening to the universe, and he hears this, and And so they start checking their equipment. They're like, something's broken, something's unplugged. It's like a guitar cable that is halfway out and it like makes that big ringing sound. They actually thought that maybe there were birds like roosting inside of their different radars and stuff like that. So they went and checked all their equipment. They're like, what the heck is that noise? Well, after testing it, the most brilliant mistake ever made is Penzias and his team discovered cosmic microwave background radiation, which means the Big Bang, which took place about 14 billion years ago, left off heat that's still measurable in our universe. The original jolt of energy from the Big Bang is still a measurable amount in our universe. And in the far reaches of space, you can go and you can notice these little echoes of an explosion. So think of like an echo when you scream like in the middle of a room that has no padding or whatever. It's like boo, boom, The Big Bang was so intense that there's still an echo happening 14 billion years later in our universe. That's going. That's what they discovered. They're like, are those chickens? It's like, oh no, that's cosmic microwave background radiation. Okay? Then, in 2006, 3 brilliant astrophysicists were charged with the notion of coming up with a current model of how they believe the universe began. Their conclusion, and I quote, is we have arrived once again at the very sticky discourse of how this universe came to be without the kickstart of a transcendent creator. That was their conclusion. Why? Because here's what they found out. That Hubble's red light shift, in order for the expansion of the universe to be true, if the expansion rate of the universe is greater than 0, which means that it's actually getting faster, then based on the principles of light and maximum speed, if you push the reverse button on the universe, if all the universe is going like this, and you stop it, and Boardvank and Guth said, but what if you push reverse? What will happen? Well, the more that they're studying, they're going, if it's expanding at a faster rate, and you push the reverse button, eventually you're going to reach what speed? Reverse button. 0. What's the opposite, or once you hit 0, then can you go negative, what's negative speed? All negative speed is positive speed in the other direction. So he said that's impossible. You couldn't have speed against speed. That doesn't make any sense. So they came up with the singularity principle, which had already been proven, that was reproven. And they said, everything that we know came from a point at which before there was nothing. Everything in the space-time continuum came from one point, and before that point, there was nothing. As Board puts it, it's as if someone told light to be, and light agreed. Okay? Next slide. Now that we've gathered information, let's test our variables. Okay? Number 1 is the static state of the universe. The static state of the universe. Can we quantifiably prove that false? The answer is yes. Why? We just gathered information. These are testable theories. You can go read peer-reviewed journal articles. Those guys aren't Christians. They're not trying to prove the God hypothesis is correct. In fact, people rejected the Big Bang model for so long. When you guys heard about it in school, a lot of you guys as Christians heard the Big Bang and you went, oh, they're trying to cancel out Christianity. Well, did you know that they tried to reject the Big Bang at first because it proved Christianity to be true? Because it proved a cosmic genesis. It proved a cosmic beginning. Okay? Now, we've been so misinformed saying that every time we find something in science, it cancels out God, but it's actually the opposite. Okay? So once we've gathered information, let's identify these variables. Number 1, the static state. The problem with the static state universe, which is the same problem with eternal pastime, Big Crunch, and multiverse theory, is this. First of all, there's an argument from philosophical eternality. Here's what I mean by that. If something is eternally past, where did it begin? Can something infinitely in the past have a beginning? No. So if it didn't have a beginning, is it possible that there's a today? Think about it. If I told you to count to infinity, what number would you start at? 1. And then you'd probably go to 2. And you would never arrive at infinity. But now, if I told you to count backwards from infinity, where would you start? Infinity is just a placeholder. It doesn't have a beginning. There's not a number. There's not a start to it. So if the universe is infinitely past, and I told you, well, here we exist today, there is no today because there was no beginning. And if we exist inside of space-time, if there's not a beginning, then there's no point at which today could be today. There's no present with the eternal past. I know it's a weird concept, but just think about it. At its core, it makes a lot of sense. How could there be a today if there was never a beginning? The timeline never kick-started. It never began. There would just be nothingness. So that's the argument from philosophical eternality. Now we have more proof than that static state is impossible, including cosmic expansion. The red light shift proved it was false. Also entropy. If the universe was eternal and all energies in the system break down over time, would there be any usable energy left in the universe? No, it'd be all gone. We can measure it. We're losing energy, okay? So if it was eternally past, all the different precepts that we know about our universe that change incrementally would not be changing incrementally. They would have all had to have changed completely because there's no present. So for instance, every year, our oceans grow in salt content. Now, it's a tiny amount, but they grow. Why? Because every time the waves hit rocks, they pull pieces of salt off of the rocks, and they bring it back into the ocean. So our salt content grows every year in our ocean. Now, if it's been doing that for eternity, what percent of the ocean would be salt? 0%. There wouldn't be an ocean. It would just be salt. You would go and you would try to go surfing on nothing. It would just be salt. You would walk out and you would find these decayed, decomposing bones. You'd be able to walk from here to England if you had that much time on your hands on a bed of salt. There'd be nothing left, okay? So the argument from eternality, everything we know about uniformitarian thinking kills it. Uniformitarian thinking is how we do carbon dating. It's how we understand past time. And that's all nullified 100% by the idea of it being an eternal past time. So we can categorically, that means fundamentally and absolutely consider anything that argues eternality of the universe to be false. Static state, false. Why? We proved it to be false. Eternal past time, impossible. The multiverse, first of all, it's just a regressive statement, okay? It's like saying, well, what if our universe just came from a multiverse generator? It's like, first of all, so something is spitting out universes for what purpose? It has to, out of its DNA. This thing has DNA? No, it just wants to. What do you mean it wants to? It has to, so it's necessary. It's necessary that thing does that, and it always existed. Yes, but it exists inside of space-time. Yes, so it has to exist inside of time, so it can't be eternal. Whatever, I'm going to go smoke pot. Like that, it's just an infinite regression. You're not really answering the question. You're just setting it back a bit, but you're not really answering anything. At some point, you still have to come to the conclusion that if all space-time began somewhere, before that, there was nothingness. So the multiverse theory is all but nullified. And here's what Alvin Plantinga, he's a famous philosopher, president of the American Philosophical Association, says this: to believe in a multiverse or the big crunch models, you might as well reject the evidence for the Earth's being round by pointing out that what if there was another world in which we had all the evidence that we already have and the Earth is flat? So it's like if I wanted to argue the Earth was flat, and you're like, no, the Earth's round, we have proof of it. And I went, but what if there's another world where we also had proof that it was round? Then the Earth would be flat. It's a non sequitur. It's post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's this logical fallacy that says, but what if something completely incongruent were the case? Then you wouldn't need a God. And you go, but we already have the evidence that that's not true. I know. Pretty crazy, huh? It's not science. That's a leap of faith. That's all it is. The big crunch model of the universe says this. Oh, and with all these, the last thing you put, there's no empirical evidence to support it. When I say empirical evidence, it's EMPI or EMP. It's not IMP. It's not empirical, like I am building my... Okay, empirical means that you can't quantify it. It's never been seen. It's never been observed. It's never been tested. It's never been measured. There's nothing to it, okay? It doesn't even bear the burden of intellectual responsibility. It's empirically false. The big crunch model, what's the problem with the big crunch model? Cosmic microwave background radiation. Again, our gathering of information canceled out that model because we have heat left over from one expansion of the universe, okay? Again, you go, well, not only do we have cosmic microwave background radiation, which falsifies that, we also have energies in the system breaking down over time, and you would have to say, well, every time it expands, it creates new energy, or it creates new matter. Well, the problem with that is everything we know to be true, that matter is neither created nor destroyed, would have to be categorically false as well. So it would be outside of any kind of science to even postulate this, and you'd have to pretty much vomit in the face of everything we know to be true about eternality in order for that to even be a hypothesis. So we can, based on what we have on the test we've done, say that 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 are categorically false. Why is the nothing hypothesis categorically false? Because it's the least scientific of all these things. It says, what if we knew everything about something, but what if everything we knew about something that we've tested and proven is the opposite of what it was? It has intelligence, it has ability, and you would be arguing with the number one rule of astrophysics, which is out of nothing, nothing comes. So it's a non-answer. It's a scapegoat. It's irrational. It doesn't bear philosophical scrutiny. It doesn't bear evidentiary scrutiny. It doesn't bear astrophysical scrutiny. It doesn't bear any scrutiny. It's just a non-answer. Then you got intelligent design. Okay, what's the problem with intelligent design? The problem with intelligent design is that you can't test supernaturalism in a lab. By nature, if you were able to test supernaturalism, it would be natural because you could create it, you could measure it, you could repeat it. Well, a super intellect speaking or creating everything out of nothing would be categorically supernatural. So the argument that some people make is, well, you can't prove God's existence. The problem with that is you're actually asking the Christian to do something that you don't ask from any other area of science. Every area of science, we gather information, we make observations, we have a hypothesis, then we test that hypothesis. And if we can prove it true, then we modify and we alter it. And if we can't, and that's the most reasonable model, then we stick to it unless we can prove it false. Well, with God, this is the only time we don't do this in science. For instance, evolution. Can anyone, I know you can't, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm talking about macroevolution, a change in kinds, not like the Galapagos Islands where it's like, well, the finch's bird changed shape. That's called adaptation. That's microevolution. If you don't believe in microadaptations or microevolution, read a book, okay? It's obvious. It's everywhere. It's genetics. It's simple. Now, if I asked you to give me an evidence anywhere in the world, observational, scientifically proven evidence of one time we've ever had a proven change in species, you would not be able to do it. And that's the foundation of all of evolution, is that everything that's ever existed came from a change in species based on mutations. And yet I say, give me one bit of data, observational scientific data, that it's ever occurred, and you can't do it. And you go, well, I can't, but no, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the scientific community has never come up with one. So, what's the theory of evolution based on? Well, we find these different transitory species where we go, look, that skull doesn't look quite human, but it also doesn't look quite primate. Therefore, let's infer all of these things, that there's this division, and then the genes mutate, and the mutations become this, and they become positive, and we gain more genetic information. And that genetic information becomes advantageous. Those advantageous people all of a sudden became conscious. And our conscious, now we're walking up, and we're all now wanting to discover the reason that we were made because of these genetic mutations that were accidents, and we're all just dancing to the tune of our DNA, born out of blind, pitiless indifference. Why? Well, we found a skull that didn't quite look human. You go, wait, you built a whole theory on that? There's no data, there's no evidence, there's no proof. There's just a theory that is the only way you can still nix out a divine creator, and that's our story, and we're sticking to it. You see the flaw fundamentally between this dichotomy of faith and science. Evolution is faith-based. In fact, as Sam Harris puts it, we have named, this is one of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse with Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, and Richard Dawkins. Sam Harris is the fourth one. We have names for people who have many beliefs for which there is no rational justification. Okay, there's no evidence for it. When their beliefs are common, we call them religious. Otherwise, they are likely to be called mad, psychotic, or delusional. Clearly, there is sanity in numbers, and yet it is merely an accident of history that it is considered normal in our society to believe that there's a creator of the universe. So the different things he states in there is that, well, there might be sanity in numbers, but it's a mistake of the universe, it's a mistake of our kind to believe that there's a creator. But I love this phrase right here. When someone has no evidence for a belief, we can consider them to be religious people. Go back one slide. Static state, no evidence. Eternal pastime, no evidence. Nothing hypothesis, absolutely no evidence. Multiverse, no evidence. Big crunch, no evidence. So when you ask Richard Dawkins what he believes about the beginning of the universe, and he says, I believe nothing created everything, Richard Dawkins would be considered someone who is religious. He worships. He's religious. He believes. He's a faith man. He's a believer in things. He trusts. regardless and even in spite of data. In fact, I think it's a leap to even say that a Christian exists in a place of less faith than someone who is empirically born out of naturalism. That is where, when I was an atheist, I looked at this and I went, this whole construct of Christians are this closed-minded people doesn't make any sense to me. They're opening up the pages of science and going, well, let's just go wherever the evidence leads, not born out of the scientific method. Why? Here's a problem with someone who goes, well, I don't believe in God, I believe in science. Who told you to believe in science? Someone did. And where'd that someone come from? Blind, pitiless indifference. Well, what is science? It's testing observation through the scientific method. Is that the true way of knowing things? Yes. Based on who? Someone else who was born out of blind, pitiless indifference. And what is your brain? Just dancing to the tune of its DNA, coming up with constructs by which we're able to perceive the world, and we don't really know what, when it comes down to it, what our brain is even made out of, or how it was made, or why it was made, or if it was made at all. It seems to just be a bunch of accidents. So your accidental brain came up with an absolutely not true, absolute truth that science is the way to know anything, and you're going to bet your eternity that someone else who is as flawed, pitiless, and indifferent as you are, in their brain that was just dancing to the tune of their DNA, came up with this construct called the scientific method, and you're going to base your life on it out of a leap of faith from someone else who is as clueless about the universe when 99% of it is dark matter and dark energy as you are. That's your faith statement. It doesn't make sense. Now you might go, well, yeah, because Christianity makes a whole bunch of sense. Right. Because a God hypothesis makes sense. It's still an a priori faith argumentation. When you're saying it doesn't make sense, all you're saying is, I don't think supernaturalism exists. If we had one bit of supernaturalism anywhere in the history of mankind, does supernaturalism exist? Yes. That's like if I told you to prove to me that there's gold in Alaska. What would you have to do? Find gold in Alaska. Well, first of all, you'd have to identify what Alaska is. You'd say it's every bit of the surface area of what we know to be Alaska. And let's say it goes a mile deep. Okay? A mile deep is where Alaska stops. If I told you to find gold in Alaska, if you dug on the whole the whole surface area of that whole state, and then you dug 200 meters down, and you found a speck of gold dust, is there gold in Alaska? Yes. Now, what if I told you to prove that there's not gold in Alaska? What would you have to do? You have to dig up every volumetric square inch of that and test it and prove to me that there's not gold in Alaska. It's a bigger thing to do. So when you make a statement like there's no such thing as supernaturalism, that's still a faith-based claim. You don't know that. You haven't been there. You weren't there during the time of the resurrection, as it were. You weren't there during creation. If creation supersedes what is natural, then guess what exists? Supernaturalism, which is the biggest endeavor for the Christian is to prove supernaturalism. But if we can, by cosmology, prove that supernaturalism is the most coherent theory, then all of a sudden you can throw supernaturalism into the mix of what science can do. Then you don't have a problem leaping to the God hypothesis because your only fundamental argument against it has been proven categorically false. If your argument is there is no supernaturalism, and yet we've read the theory that supernaturalism must have occurred, then your whole argument against God and why it's irrational because it's not natural actually goes bye-bye. Now you're stuck with only arguing against the God hypothesis based on pride, going, well, what if we just don't know? Again, that would be the only field of science where a bunch of people with facts go, let's just not have any theory until we find out all the facts. I love what this guy said about that. Let me find what I'm talking about. It is said that an argument is this is what Vlanken, okay? So intelligent design, go back one. Gathering information, Board Vlanken Guth. The second guy in that, he was the one who kind of helped to originate the hypothesis of the original singularity principle. Not a Christian, but he said this. It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning, says Vlanken. So, with this information, testing the God hypothesis, identifying the variables, testing those variables, then the God hypothesis, go to the next screen, please. The God hypothesis of intelligent design doesn't just solve cosmic genesis, it also satisfies our observations about the rest of the world. Love makes sense. 1 John 4 says, God is love. Brothers and sisters, let us love one another, for love comes from God. And anyone that loves is born of God and knows God. If you do not love, then you do not know God, because God is love. And if God created and breathed life into every last human being, it also says in the Old Testament that God has written the law on the hearts of man, which is why we can make the same argument in completely different cultures that rape is inherently wrong. Why? Because he wrote it on your heart and he wrote it on my heart. And the only people who believe that it's okay is people who are demented or have been brainwashed or in a moment have decided to pursue what they know is wrong instead of what they know to be right. When someone is convicted of rape and they're sitting on the witness stand, they never make the argument that they did not know it was wrong. They make the argument that they didn't do it or that it was consensual. But no one gets up there and goes, I raped her, yes. But it wasn't wrong. No. You try to show evidence that you didn't do it. You try to show that you weren't there. You try to show that it was consensual. But no one stands up there and goes, if I'm just dancing to the tune of my DNA, how could you possibly put me in jail for that? I'm doing exactly what my DNA told me to do, and you're going to put me in prison? Well, it's a social construct, so it can further on our species. Is that a good thing? Of course it's a good thing. Says who? Well, survival's good. Why is survival good? It just seems to be. You're right. I know why, but can you tell me why? Well, things want to live. Wanting is good. Survival is good. You keep appealing to something. What is it? Is this cosmic eye in the sky? Why you keep saying fundamentally, it just is. I believe that isness comes from a God writing the law in our hearts. So all those parts of our observational universe, that humans are different than everything else in creation. Who tells us that? The book of Genesis tells us that. That God breathed into man the living soul. The only thing that has a soul is mankind. We're different. We're unique. We want to know where we came from. Cows don't have existential moments where they're like, freaking water again. Grass. Everywhere is grass. And where do we go when we die? You never seen a cow just sitting there just like, everyone else is eating and it's just standing in the back like, no. What is food? It's going to be turned into a... In fact, if I don't eat, you're less likely to murder me. Because what are you going to eat? I'm too skinny. Right? Cows are just, they dance to the tune of their DNA. There's some food. I'm going to eat that food. Slaughterhouse, what's a slaughterhouse? Seems nice. Gone. There's something unique about it. You see, the God hypothesis doesn't just satisfy this. Psalm 90 verse 2 says this. Before anything was formed, before the mountains were laid, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. The book of Exodus chapter 3, when God first reveals himself to mankind, he calls himself Am. He says, I am, Yahweh. That's what that word Yahweh means. It means I was, I am, I always will be. The very first sentence of the Bible says, in the beginning, the Alpha to Omega God created the heavens and the earth. That means I was there at the beginning, I'm there at the end, I am all places at all times, I'm outside of space, I'm outside of time, I'm eternal. And so right now in the 21st century, we're going, listen, here's what we found out. There was a cosmic beginning. It's as if in the beginning there was this blast of light. It's as if something that was super intellectual created everything on purpose, for purpose, and they said, let there be light. And that light, we can still hear the hum of it left over in the universe. But it goes even further than that. This Alpha to Omega God created everything that we know. And there seems to be this complexity. Why? Because there seems to be an intelligence. So an intelligent designer would have had to make this. Now, what does he sound like? And the Bible is saying, here's what you're going to find. Romans 1, 19 through 20. For since the beginning of time, God's invisible qualities and his divine nature have been clearly seen, so that no one is without excuse. So the Bible says, eventually you're going to find out that everything you perceive and observe about the universe points back to a creator. Board, Blanket, and Guth. And I quote, we have arrived once again at the very sticky discourse of how this universe came to be without the hand of a transcendent creator. What does transcendent mean? Outside of time and space. What does Psalm 90 say? He was outside of time and space. What does Genesis 1 say? He was outside of time and space. What does Exodus 3 say? He's outside of time and space. What does Isaiah 55 say? He's outside of time and space. What does Isaiah 13 say? He's outside of time and space. All through the Bible. Why? You think these people who are writing this hoax, who wrote it just to have some society by which everyone obeyed rules, guessed that the world was spherical thousands of years before we understood it? You think they guessed that the winds moved in cyclones in the Old Testament just out of nothing? Do you think they got these concepts because they were just making up a hoax and they happened to get it right again and again? Let me give you some quotes as we wrap up. Stephen Hawking, the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang on accident are enormous. I think there are religious implications whenever you start to discuss the origins of the universe. Thomas Nagel, philosophy professor at NYU. I want atheism to be true, and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Richard Lewontin, evolutionary biologist, says this: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense. Richard Lewontin, evolutionary biologist, says, the scientific community has a habit of accepting claims that don't make any sense. And then he goes on to say, here's why. We have these big tests, and we call them evidence. But at the end of the day, who says it's evidence? What's evidence? But we keep using bigger and bigger words to make you feel like you're dumb. But when someone simplifies it to its core, it just doesn't make any sense. Well, here's what it is. It's ex nihilo. It's the nothing hypothesis. You see, everything that we know to be true about the empirical datum of, and then he goes, but when you just ask someone, do you think that everything came out of nothing? They go, no. That's as easy as it is. Stop making these big statements. That's as simple as it is. Here's what he says. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of the extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment. You see, we have a commitment to materialism. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow teach us or compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. He patently criticizes his own community, going, you guys are making up weird things. You go, well, we'll know God is true if he yells out and reveals himself to us. And you go, that's not how you do science. But we sit up in our ivory towers of scientific method and we go, well, this is what you'd have to do. Says who? He said it's patently absurd, the constructs we give to prove God, because we don't want it to be true. Continuing. David Hume, philosophical empiricist, says this: I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. He says everything's caused. He's an atheist. He says, but everything has a cause. He said that before we knew that the universe had a beginning. And everything that begins to exist has a cause. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So if it arose out of nothing, then it arose out of a cause. Francis Collins, scientist who won the National Medal of Science for mapping out the human genome for the first time. He's getting an award from President Obama right there. The Big Bang cries out for a divine explanation. It forces the conclusion that nature had a defined beginning. I cannot see how nature could have created itself. Only a supernatural force that is outside of space and time could have done that. Psalm 90, verse 2. Exodus chapter 3, Genesis chapter 1, Isaiah 55. J.M. Wersinger, Auburn professor of physics. There is no problem with Big Bang cosmology and the singularity. In other words, no one refutes it. But it was originally rejected by the scientific community because it gave into the Judeo-Christian idea of the beginning of the world and seems to call for an act of supernatural creation. It took mountains of irrefutable evidence for the scientific community to finally accept a cosmic genesis, a successful model that imposed itself on a very reluctant scientific community. Lastly, Robert Jastrow, astrophysicist, says this: now we see how the astronomical evidence supports the biblical view of the origin of the world. The details differ, but the essential elements in the astronomical and biblical account of Genesis are the same. The chain of events leading to man commenced suddenly and sharply at a definite moment in time in a flash of light and energy. Astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of everything in the cosmos. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are supernatural forces at work is now, I believe, a scientifically proven fact. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends for him like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. These aren't Christians. This is just people who are finally pushing back on science and going, for years you've been ostracizing and you've been knocking out Christians and firing them. This happened last week. This guy's an archaeologist, and he found soft tissue in a dinosaur skeleton. If the dinosaurs have existed for that many hundreds of millions of years, does soft tissue exist that long? No. When he found it, he published in a peer-reviewed journal. That means a bunch of people who saw his findings, who were well-informed in the field, agreed that his conclusions were correct, that perhaps the age of dinosaurs is much different than we thought. You want to know what happened to him? He got fired. He lost his job. He can't feed his family anymore because he was willing to say, this is soft tissue. And they're like, don't say it out loud. And he goes, I mean, it's freaking soft tissue. What do you mean I can't say it out loud? Everyone knows the implications of soft tissue. It throws a wrench in everything that scientific method does about uniformitarian thinking. And he says, well, what if? What I'm saying is don't buy in. Don't buy into the media that says we're all trying to kill each other and that every last person is racist. Don't buy into that method of thinking. Are there racist people? Yeah. And they're twisted and sick and they're not okay. But we keep buying into these different things without any evidence to support it. Christians are just brainless and they don't even know. Says who? Scientists deal with facts. Doesn't look like it. In fact, based on Sam Harris, the atheist explanation, we can call the scientific community a little bit more religious than Christians. They're slightly more belief-oriented than a Christian is. They're more faith-based than a Christian is. Because at least our working God hypothesis has no refutations other than, well, what if possibly supernaturalism doesn't exist? Every one of theirs has been categorically proven false. What I want from you is not for this just to be a head journey, though. You got to get the implications of you being designed on purpose. That means you probably weren't designed out of any kind of an accident. And if someone has designed you intentionally and on purpose, he probably has a desire for you. For you weren't born out of necessity. You are a contingent being. You were made out of purpose. You were made not by accident, but out of intentionality. Don't you want to find out what that is then? Don't you want to understand what that looks like? And we haven't even walked towards Christianity yet. I can't go, guys, a super intellect exists. Therefore, the Bible is true. That is a leap in logic that I'm not willing to make. But we can look empirically and go, the most rational hypothesis we have is a God hypothesis. Next week, we're going to go, well, that doesn't lead us to Christianity. What would? Is the Bible true? Was it just some cosmic hoax that someone made up? Were they just trying to have an opiate for society? That's what we're going to look at next week and go, so what? So God exists. Now what? The next question is, has he ever revealed himself to us? And if so, what's the most likely way that he did so? Is there a book in which there exist hundreds and hundreds of prophecies that thousands of years ahead of time came true? Because that's what this God said, here's how I'm going to prove to you that I am God. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen thousands of years before it happens. Wouldn't that help? What if I told you exactly the cities that were going to be born by name before they were ever created? Would that help? What if I told you thousands of years before you discovered that air moved in cyclones, that it moves in cyclones? Would that help you? What if I called it a sphere before anyone knew that it was a sphere? Would that help you? And you go, well, that's hypocritical because the Christian community, the Catholic Church, murdered people like Galileo and Copernicus for their theories. Did you know that's completely false? Have you ever done the research or you just keep regurgitating information? Did you know that's not true at all? Did you know they weren't persecuted for their belief system? Here's what happened to Copernicus. He was, by the end of his life, because of different heresies he believed concerning the Trinity, not concerning the spherical nature of the world, placed under house arrest. What I'm saying is don't be another generation of sheep that just go, meh, feed me, whatever you want me to know. No. Even if your conclusion, you find some other hypothesis that makes more sense than God, then freaking find it. But don't just sit here and take everything for granted and go, well, the multiverse. Have you ever stopped and thought about it? And obviously, there's got to be a 12-inch journey from your head to your heart by which me as a Christian say, look, you're not just made on purpose. You're made for a purpose. And I want you to find that purpose. Because in it, I've found a life that's unlike any life I could possibly imagine. As an atheist, on a journey to find truth, I wound up at the feet of God, who has changed my life, who has changed my marriage, who has changed my outlook on everything, who's given me peace and hope and purpose and reason and joy. So it can't just be an intellectual endeavor. It's got to go somewhere. And I hope in the next couple of weeks we can take that journey from, okay, there's a God, to what is he like? And what does that mean for me? Let's pray. God, for all of your goodness and your mercy, and for your creation, the complexity of the intelligent mind that creates people who can come up with intelligent minds to question your intelligent mind is so beautiful. God, may we seek truth in whatever form it is. We love you and we thank you for your gift of life for us and your gift of pursuit for us, and that you made us for your glory, but you also gave us a choice to reject you completely. We thank you for what you've done. In your name we pray. Amen.